Now, staying faithful to God is one of the most important things in a Christian life. Staying faithful to God even when times are tough. Staying faithful to God even when things aren't turning out the way we want them to. Staying faithful to God even if we don't have what we want. Staying faithful to God even when people turn our backs on us. To have faith in God is to have total reliance, being loyal, and having complete trust with God. Now, we've all been through bad things in our life, and some more than others' lives, but it's still important to stay faithful to God during these times. And I think Joseph, this Joseph from Genesis, his story gives us a great example on how to stay faithful to God at all times during our lives, even when times are tough. And today, I will tell you that story and what lessons we can learn from it today. Joseph's story starts in the land of Canaan, where he had a father named Jacob and 12 brothers. Now, you see, Joseph had these dreams where his brothers were bowing down to him, and he was also the favorite child. And on top of that, their father made him a special robe, which made them extra jealous. Now you see, we can get our first lesson from this, because this proves that jealousy is bad, because it leads them to do what they're going to do next. And that thing that they're going to do is that they're going to plot to kill him. But eventually, he just gets sold into slavery, into Egypt. Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of the palace guard of Pharaoh in Egypt. Eventually, Potiphar noticed that God was with Joseph, and Joseph had favor in God's eyes, but Joseph still had many challenges to overcome. Genesis 36, 6-10 says, "So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and his master's wife eventually noticed Joseph and told him, 'Come to bed with me.' But he refused and said, 'With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns is entrusted to my care. No one in this house is greater than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me in this house except for you, because you're his wife. Now how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?' And even though she spoke to him day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be near her." You see, sometimes God will allow your faith to get tested in your life, and Joseph's way of responding to this is a great way how we should respond to temptation, is by fleeing from it. You know, it said that he wouldn't even get near her. And in our lives sometimes we don't even need to get near the things that cause us to sin. Now, I'm not saying go live off as some caveman or whatever. We should try to avoid temptation and resist temptation and sin in our lives. And Joseph did resist it by refusing to even be near the woman that tempted her. Or him, I meant to say. And you see, Joseph made a good decision by following God and not his own desires and, passions. Because imagine if he would have followed his own desires and slept with that woman, there would have been devastating consequences. He would have sinned against God, given up his morals. So we can see here that following God is still working out for him in a good way, by him making good decisions. However, the temptation persisted, and Potiphar's wife did this. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left the cloak in her hand, and he ran out. You see here, Joseph fled the temptation And that's what we should do in our lives whenever we get temptations. We should flee the temptation by pursuing righteousness, peace, faith, and love. And you see, this verse is telling us, that verse was 2 Timothy 2:22, is that we should run away from these lusts. But you see, it's kind of like replacing a bad habit. When you get rid of a bad habit, you gotta replace it with a good habit. And you see here, it's telling you to resist the youthful, lustful desires, but it also tells you to replace that by pursuing something else. And that is righteousness. That is truth. That is what is good. You see, you can't just stop doing something bad. There's still a void that you gotta fill with good things. Don't be fooled. More videos about how to flee temptation will be made in the future. But you see, we should flee temptation even if we have to physically remove ourselves from the situation we're in right now. 2 Timothy 2:22 says, "Flee the desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call upon the Lord with a pure heart." But eventually, Potiphar's wife told Potiphar a lie, and that lie was that Joseph tried to get with her when it was really the other way around. But even in this time where this bad stuff was happening to Joseph and these lies were being spread about him, God was still with him. And he eventually ended up locking up Joseph. But God was still with Joseph, and God eventually ended up granting Joseph favor in the warden's eyes. And the prison warden ended up entrusting Joseph and giving him the responsibilities of the prison. Eventually, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker went to the same jail as Joseph. Later that night, the cupbearer and baker had dreams, and Joseph said he could interpret the dreams, but something peculiar he did was that he focused on God rather than himself when explaining that he could interpret their dreams. And you see, this is a good example of how we should give our gifts that God gives to us to glorify him and give it back to him, because that's what Joseph did with his gift God gave him. He turned it back to God and glorified him rather than himself. Later on, the interpretations of those dreams Joseph gave came true. The cupbearer promised to tell Pharaoh about Joseph, but he ended up forgetting about Joseph, and Joseph was still locked in prison for 2 more years. Now you see, in our lives, we may feel like we've been left behind, we've been left in the dust, we've been forgotten about, but God doesn't forget about his children. We gotta stay faithful to God, because he doesn't forget about his people. He doesn't forget about his children. So don't feel like you've been forsaken or left in the dust, because God still cares about you and he doesn't forsake his children. But even in those hard times, you still got to stay faithful to God, because those hard times are, those times are the times where your faith and your spirit gets strengthened. And if you stay faithful to God throughout it all, you're going to come back as an even stronger follower of God, an even stronger Christian. So you still got to stay faithful to God during those hard times, because you're going to come out stronger at the end, spiritually, in your relationship with God. Joseph continued to stay faithful for the extra 2 years he was in prison, but then the Pharaoh had a dream that deeply troubled him. And then the cupbearer was reminded about his promise to Joseph, and he tells Pharaoh about it. And since Pharaoh trusted his cupbearer, he was also going to trust Joseph. So Pharaoh meets up with Joseph, and Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream and tells the Pharaoh that there's going to be 7 good years of harvest, then 7 years of famine, so they got to start storing up now for those 7 years of famine later on. And Pharaoh, since he trusts Joseph, makes him second in command in the entirety of Egypt. Joseph started off as a lowly prisoner, but since he had faith in God and he trusted in God at all times, he got moved up to be the second highest ranked person in all of Egypt. So Egypt stores up for the 7 years of famine, and then once the famine happens, people from all over the land come to Egypt because they stored up for the famine. And this famine is so widespread that even people from Canaan are needing some food from Egypt. And who lives in Canaan? That's right, Joseph's old family, with his brothers and dad and his mom. So his brothers go on to Egypt, and they ask for some food. And Joseph is the one they're confronted with, but they don't recognize Joseph. But Joseph recognizes them. So Joseph, to see if they changed, put them through some tests. And after the younger brother was accused of stealing something and was threatened to be put into slavery, one of his brothers stepped up to be in his place so that his younger brother could go back to his father's place. This made Joseph and made him so happy that his brothers changed, and in the way they treated their new younger brother, that he wept so loud everyone in Egypt could hear him. And he made himself known to his brothers. So his father is notified about all this, and Joseph, his brothers, and his father live in the kingdom of Egypt. And Genesis 50 verse 20 really wraps up the theme of this story. And really for the book of Genesis as a whole. And that verse is, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done now, the saving of many lives." This whole story reminds us how God can take a really bad situation and turn it around, and that's why we should be thankful and grateful to God at all times, even when times are rough. This happy ending was attained by Joseph being faithful to God at all times. And even if stuff doesn't turn out the way we want it to, even when we're thankful to God, we still gotta be faithful to God and His covenant, because what matters at the end of the day, at the end of your life, is if you were faithful to God or not. Now, you may not get some rich treasures like Joseph got in this life, but if you stay faithful to God in this life, and you do the right thing, and you flee temptation, then God will reward you in the next life, even if you don't achieve or gain much in this life. And I know this is not me trying to say this is a works-based salvation. Salvation is still by faith. If you are saved, this story is an encouragement to stay faithful to God. And the story of Job, if you read the book of Job, he was a good man. He was faithful to God, and he had all this good stuff. But the devil still, and all these bad things still happen to him. And God tells Job that we can't possibly know why all this bad stuff happens. We can't understand the intricacies of the universe, and only God knows that stuff. So we can't truly know all that stuff in this life. And that's what God tells Job in the book of Job, when his stuff gets taken away and all this bad stuff happens to him. So this kind of ties in with the message of Job also, that bad things still happen to good people, but we still gotta stay faithful to God. And some preachers might try to sadly turn around this message of staying faithful to God and try to say you're gonna get a bunch of money, say you're gonna get a private jet. We've all seen those TV preachers that say, oh, if you give this much during the offering, or if you do this or that, then you will get your dream job, you will get your dream car, you will get your dream girl. But that's not what following God is about, and staying faithful to God is about. That's not what it's about. And some preachers sadly twist that. Staying faithful to God is staying faithful no matter what the circumstances are. So you can be in God's confidence and be a good Christian and achieve stuff in the next life, even if you don't gain earthly pleasures in this life. Stay faithful and follow God at all times in life, and encourage you to flee from temptation and fight the good fight, because it is all worth it in the end, whether you gain pleasures in this life, the next one, or both. So, I hope this video gave you some encouragement. I love y'all. Jesus loves y'all. Have a wonderful day, and Merry Christmas to all of you.
Would you be free from your burden of sin?